As a white person, it's not really a culture.
But then when you say I am a proud white person, already there's so much like hate involved in that.
You don't have a fucking culture.
I don't?
No, you don't.
Oh.
We're fucking white. We don't have a goddamn fucking culture.
That's the most embarrassing thing, is to be an American.
We need to open our eyes.
My old man and my grandpa, first white man to the Cumberland Gap. My old man and my grandpa, first white man to the Cumberland Gap.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, you caught me. That wasn't the Pledge of Allegiance. It was the preamble to the Constitution. I'm just kidding, folks. We all know that it was the Declaration of Independence. Probably the most quoted line from any document in American history. If you went to U.S. public school, there's a good chance you had to memorize it for your 8th grade history class. Your average American can probably recite it by heart.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Well, most Americans. And while it is the most well-known line from the Declaration of Independence, maybe the only line most of us know, it is not the most important line. If you scroll down a little bit in the text, there's a list of grievances the colonists had with King George that was their justification for declaring independence from the British Empire. You've probably heard some of them. Something about taxation without representation, trial by jury, quartering large bodies of armed troops among the colonists. But there's one grievance you may not have heard. It's the very last bullet point on the list, and it says, "He, King George, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." While it doesn't get as much attention as the opening lines about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I would argue that that final bullet point is actually the most important line in the Declaration of Independence. That may seem like a bold statement. If that line is so important, then why didn't we learn about it in a Schoolhouse Rock song? Well, one of the reasons that line is so important is because it's what truly united the colonies to declare independence from the British. In the popular imagination of the colonists, it was the worst offense that King George had committed against them. That the king would employ Indian savages to fight against the American revolutionaries was a pretty big deal, as we'll see. But apart from that, that line describes how Americans came to be American. It may seem a little politically incorrect to some of you, maybe just a tiny bit racist. It might even seem a little bit hypocritical of Thomas Jefferson to declare all men to be created equal, and then just a few paragraphs later launch into a tirade against the merciless Indian savages. But that line about the merciless Indian savages characterizes America's ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis, what does that word mean? Ethnogenesis is the process whereby a new ethnicity comes into existence, the formation of a new ethnic group, when a people become ethnically distinct. This is a process we see all throughout history. It can take various forms. Maybe one group or clan breaks off from another group and starts to develop their own language, customs, traditions, and genetics that make them a distinct people. Or maybe various tribes and clans come together to create a new ethnicity. For example, take the Germans. There were a bunch of different Germanic tribes that saw themselves as distinct from one another, but when Rome invaded Germania, the tribes united and defeated the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and over many more centuries of common struggle and the formation of common German culture, language, and blood, you get what we now call Germans. Or take the Afrikaners in South Africa. At one point, they were just Dutchmen who went down to the Cape of Africa, but over time and through their unique experience of settling Africa, they eventually came to be ethnically distinct from the Dutch and are now known as the Afrikaners, or Boers. Ethnogenesis pretty much always occurs when one group defines themselves against another group. You need an out-group in order to have an in-group, right? So in the case of Germany, the various Germanic tribes united because they were more similar to each other than to the invading Romans, and had common interests in defeating the Romans. In-group good, out-group bad. That's kind of the SparkNotes version of it, and maybe some history nerds would disagree if that was actually the beginning of German ethnogenesis, but you get the idea. Ethnogenesis is a long and winding process, and you typically can't point to a single moment when a new ethnicity is formed, as it's a very organic process. Now, how does this relate to America? In 21st century America, a lot of people don't really think of American as being its own ethnicity. We're the melting pot of the world, right? A nation of immigrants, as they say.
Let me tell you something. I don't care who you are, where you come from. This is a country of immigrants.
America is just an idea.
America is an idea, the most unique idea in history. We are created, all of us equal. It's who we are.
As long as you fill out the right paperwork and believe in freedom and equality, then anyone can be an American. In fact, maybe new immigrants are even more American than Americans. As Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it,
the women and children on that border that are trying to seek refuge and seek opportunity in the United States of America with nothing but the shirt on their backs are acting more American than any person who seeks to keep them out ever will be.
Is she right? After all, doesn't the poem on the Statue of Liberty say, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free air"? Isn't that what America is all about? In 1976, when he was still a senator, President Biden said, "If France tomorrow, for example, were to turn into a monarchy, I do not believe France would substantially change, because in France there is an ethnicity that binds them together, a cultural tie. You don't have that in America." Americans, according to this model, are a people defined by political institutions. And this view is pretty much uniquely applied to just Americans. If, say, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian moved to Shanghai and was able to get citizenship in China, most people wouldn't say that he's Chinese. They would say he's a Norwegian living in China. Even if that Norwegian was born in China and spoke Mandarin, I don't think anyone in China would believe that that person was actually Chinese. I don't think they would look at him as their, Chinese brother or whatever. Hello, my blonde-haired, blue-eyed Chinese brother. They would probably just see him as a foreigner living in China. If you ask an American what their ethnicity is, a lot of the times they'll appeal to some European country that some of their ancestors came from. They might say, "Oh, well, my family is Irish, or we're German, or I just took a DNA test and it turns out my family is Italian." It seems like most Americans have kind of bought into this passport version of America, where anyone can be American as long as they fill out the right papers. But this wasn't always the case. There was a time not too long ago when being American actually did mean more than just your citizenship status. It meant you belonged to a people, or a nation. And when I say nation here, I mean it in the classical sense. I'll define that too. Currently, when someone says the word nation, they usually mean a country. But that's not really how it's been used historically. Historically, nation has been more or less synonymous with ethnicity. And you still see remnants of this definition in how we talk, because in the US, for example, there's the Navajo Nation or the Cherokee Nation. The Navajos are, of course, US citizens, but we recognize that they are their own nation that is distinct from the American nation, hence why they are called the Navajo Nation. A nation is a people with a common language, common culture, common history, and common blood. Nation actually comes from the Latin word natio, which means relating to birth. If anyone listening speaks Spanish, you know the word nacer means to be born, and nación means nation. Nacer, nación. In English, natal means relating to birth, like prenatal care is the medical care a woman gets during pregnancy. Natal, nation. This is also where the word native comes from. They all have the same root. You get the idea. Nationhood is something you inherit by way of birth, not by way of paperwork. Some countries have multiple nations, like, say, Spain, which has Spaniards as well as Basques, two different nations sharing the same country. And some nations don't have a country at all, like the Kurds. The Kurds are a stateless people who are spread out over several countries in the Middle East. Or take the Polish nation before the end of World War I. Poland, as a country, didn't exist until after World War I, but the Poles were still a nation even before they had their own country. So a nation isn't just a country, it's an ethnicity. In fact, in Greek, the word for nation is ethnos, which, as you can imagine, is where we get the word ethnicity from. So going forward, I will be using nation and ethnicity pretty much interchangeably. Anyways, getting back to America and the Declaration of Independence. Despite this modern misconception that being American is just an idea and has no ethnic connotations to it, Americans are in fact a distinct people. And that line in the Declaration of Independence about the merciless Indian savages is the most important line because it describes how we came to be a distinct people. But to show this, we're going to have to rewind a bit to the year 1587. It's not a year you hear too much about when it comes to American history. If you asked your average American what year they think America began, they'd probably say 1776. Maybe some would say 1620, the year the Mayflower landed on Plymouth Rock. Maybe some would say 1607, the year the Jamestown colony was founded. But I'm going to take it back even further and say that the year that America began, the year America was born, was 1587. Well, that's the year that our ethnogenesis began. As I said earlier, ethnogenesis is an organic process that's hard to really pin dates to. As I'm sure most of you know, America started out as a British colony, and it's difficult to say at what point America became ethnically distinct from the British. Did we become a separate people when they signed the Declaration of Independence? Or were we already a separate people, and the Declaration of Independence just formalized that reality? Hard to say for sure, but we can point to the exact year that we began branching off the British and started down the road of becoming our own nation. And that year was 1587, because that was the year that the first American was born. Her name was Virginia Dare. She was the first Anglo-Saxon child born in the New World. We really don't know much about Virginia Dare. The details of her life, or even how long she lived, remain a mystery. She was born in the lost colony of Roanoke. Roanoke was the first attempt at a permanent English settlement in North America. The settlers landed in 1585, and they were plagued with hardship from the beginning, as you can imagine. On August 18th, 1587, Virginia Dare was born, and by the end of that year, things had gotten so bad in Roanoke that some of the settlers, led by Virginia Dare's grandfather, went on a voyage back to England for a resupply mission. And when they got back in 1590, the colony had been abandoned. The walls of their settlement had been fortified, but the fort was empty. Everyone was gone. No one really knows what happened to them. Some people think they went to a nearby island called Croatoan, but when they searched the island, nothing was found. When John Smith, the same John Smith from Pocahontas, asked one of the chief Powhatans what had happened to the colony, he said that his tribe killed them. Some historians think that the chief was just saying that to scare John Smith and the English, to stop more of them from coming over, because they found no archaeological evidence that they were killed by the Indians. I'll let you be the judge, but there is no historical consensus on what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke that Virginia Dare was born in. Anyways, Virginia Dare was the first American, or maybe you could say Proto-American, and after the initial failure of the Roanoke colony, the English did eventually establish their first colony in 1607, which was the Jamestown colony. Like Roanoke, life in Jamestown was fraught with hardship, the usual issues you'd expect: disease, starvation, and of course, attacks by hostile natives. One example of these hostilities is the story of Governor John Ratcliffe. You've probably seen Disney's Pocahontas, and if you don't remember, John Ratcliffe was the fat guy with the goatee. He's kind of the bad guy in the movie. Well, in 1609, just 2 years after Jamestown was established, during a period aptly known as the Starving Times, John Ratcliffe and a group of 25 colonists were invited to a gathering with Powhatan Indians to trade corn. According to the eyewitness accounts, after this group got to the Powhatan village, the chief ambushed Ratcliffe and, quote, took him alive and caused him to be bound to a tree naked, with a fire before him. And by women his flesh was scraped from his bones with mussel shells, and before his face thrown into the fire, and so for want of circumspection miserably perished. So yeah, the dude was literally skinned alive, and his flesh was burned in a fire right in front of him. Somehow that part didn't make it into the Disney movie. I can't imagine why. But such were the trials and tribulations of the early Americans. And of course, the colonists attacked the Indians as well. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of tit for tat. But in 1610, the London Company instructed the Jamestown colonists to Christianize and absorb the Indians into their colony. Skirmishes continued for a bit, but things eventually simmered down and there was a peace between the colonists and the Indians. And for a time, it seemed like the plan of the London Company could be fulfilled. The settlers would mix with the natives, assimilate them, and we'd probably have ended up with something like you have in Mexico, where most people are a mix of indigenous and European descent. But the process of assimilation was disrupted on March 22nd of 1622. On that day, Chief Opeshankanu sent members of his tribe to the fledgling colony with turkey, fish, fruits, and other provisions, as if to sell to them. But once inside the homes of the white settlers, they grabbed whatever tool or weapon they could find and attacked. In total, they killed 347 men, women, and children, about 1/4 of the colony. And thus ended the peace, and more importantly, thus ended the ongoing process of assimilation that had been taking place. You could make the argument that that was the day that whiteness began in America. No longer would there be this project of assimilating the natives and bringing them into the fold. Whites were white, and Indians were Indians. Ironically, Chief Opeshankanu's name means he whose spirit is white. Opeshankanu thought that the whites would behave as other Indian tribes would, and pack up and leave when things got tough. He told another tribe that he believed in 2 months' time there would not be an Englishman in all their countries. Obviously that didn't happen, and over the next 10 years, the colonists used the Jamestown Massacre as justification for capturing more and more Powhatan territory. It's worth pointing out a significant difference between the English style of settlement and the Spanish style here. When the Spanish conquered Mexico, the first wave of Spaniards were the conquistadors. They were soldiers who conquered the natives before any significant attempt at permanent settlement were made. In the case of the English, they sent families to colonize. Some of them may have been soldiers, but many were craftsmen or farmers, sailors, fishermen, whatever. So you had civilians and laymen fighting the Indians themselves, instead of a professional class of soldiers. And because of this, the English developed a stronger sense of in-group preference and out-group hostility with regard to the natives. In contrast, when Spanish civilians started showing up to settle Mexico, they were dealing with natives that for the most part had already been defeated and didn't pose as much of a threat. So it made intermixing with the natives much more feasible. It's a lot easier to marry someone whose people have already been defeated and are no longer trying to kill you. In the case of the Spanish, many of the settlers were single men with no wives, so often their only option for marriage was with the natives. In contrast, the English sent families to colonize the New World. And that's part of why today most Mexicans are of mixed European and Indian ancestry, and most Americans aren't. I mean, sure, there's these people that have this family lore about, oh, I'm part Cherokee. But for the most part, it's pretty obvious that Americans are white. It's worth pointing out that this goes completely contrary to the current kind of academic rhetoric you hear about race. It's kind of in vogue these days to say that race is just a social construct that the powers that be created out of whole cloth in order to divide people. But here you see it was just the opposite. The powers that be, in this case the London Charter, wanted the settlers to intermix with the natives, and thus do away with race altogether. But it didn't quite work out that way. It reminds me of an interesting quote from the leftist academic Noam Chomsky. He said, "See, capitalism is not fundamentally racist. It can exploit racism for its purposes, but racism isn't built into it. Capitalism basically wants people to be interchangeable cogs, and differences among them, such as on the basis of race, usually are not functional. I mean, they may be functional for a period, like if you want a super exploited workforce or something, but those situations are kind of anomalous. Over the long term, you can expect capitalism to be anti-racist just because it's anti-human." Chomsky uses the word capitalism. Maybe some people listening would be more comfortable with a word like globalism. It's worth pointing out that communism actually seeks to do the same, break down the natural barriers of race and ethnicity in order to turn people into interchangeable cogs. And this is a perfect example of that. The London Charter wanted everyone to just be the same. They wanted to do away with race altogether. But the reality on the ground made that impossible. So if 1587 was the year that America was born, you could say that 1622, the year of the Jamestown Massacre, was the year that white America was born. That was the year it became clear that there wasn't going to be a peace with the natives, and Americans were going to be white, and America wasn't going to be like Mexico, where there was a large degree of intermixing with the Europeans and the natives. So, aggression and hostilities between the settlers and the Indians continued. In 1675, in the northern colonies, there was King Philip's War. King Philip was the English name of the Wampanoag chief Mecommit. Chief Mecommit decided that the white colonists had become too numerous and that their cows and pigs were running rampant through the Indian hunting grounds, and they had to be dealt with. So King Philip waged what was essentially an all-out race war against the white settlers, determined to drive them out for good. 50% of settlements in New England were attacked. 12 towns were completely destroyed. The war destroyed all economic activity in Rhode Island and the Plymouth colonies. Historians estimate that 10% of New England's fighting-age male population was killed in this war. For comparison, the American Civil War, which is the most American casualties of any war in American history, only 2.5% of the fighting-age male population was killed. A woman named Mary Rowlands, who was captured during King Philip's War, had a memoir published shortly after that was widely circulated in the colonies. One passage in her memoir reads, "'Tis a solemn sight to see so many Christians lying in their blood, some here and some there, like a company of sheep torn by wolves, all of them stripped naked by a company of hellhounds, roaring, singing, ranting, and insulting, as if they would have torn out our very hearts." Another, Reverend William Hubbard, in his book History of the Indian Wars in New England, also published shortly after the war, wrote, "Here the barbarous villains showed their insolent rage and cruelty more than ever before, cutting off the heads of some of the slain and fixing them upon poles near the highway. And not only so, but one was found with a chain hooked into his underjaw, and so hung up on the bough of a tree. 'Tis feared he was hung up alive, by which means they thought to daunt and discourage any that might come to their relief, and also to terrify those that should be spectators with beholding so sad an object." Pretty gruesome stuff. King Philip's War only lasted a year and ended with the death of Chief Metcalfe. To this day, it is considered the deadliest war per capita in American history. And this had happened just a century before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So if you were growing up in the colonies during the lead up to the Revolution, you probably had a parent or a grandparent that had lived through some of this. Maybe your grandpa told you stories about the horrors of the merciless Indian savages, or maybe you'd heard of attacks that had happened in your own lifetime, because it didn't end with King Philip's War. In 1758, just another example, Fort Sabert in the backcountry of Virginia was attacked. The son of Jacob Sabert, after whom the fort was named, said of the attack, "The prisoners were then arranged in 2 rows, about 10 feet apart. 2 selected from the warriors each took a tomahawk, and passing along both lines, killed all the old people and such as they thought they could not travel. Soon after the work of death was complete, they set fire to the fort and all the buildings and departed for home. Some of the survivors were then taken captive by the natives and were led back to their encampments." And Sabert writes of the journey, "The first occurrence on the journey worthy of notice was an act of great barbarity. One of the prisoners was the mother of a young infant. This child, after several days of exposure, became ill and very fretful. The mother, of course, did what she could to keep it quiet, but could not always succeed. During a fit of crying, an Indian appeared with his tomahawk raised, evidently intending its death. The mother, on seeing this, made more than usual efforts, and the crying was stopped. The fatal blow was not then inflicted. The next day the baby began crying again. The Indian returned, began wrestling after the child and the mother, cut it on the head with his tomahawk, dashed out its brains against a tree, threw it down, and passed on." So that was in 1758, less than 20 years before the War of Independence. And by this point, Indian attacks were pretty much relegated to the backcountry, and there were plenty of others. You can imagine that if you grew up hearing of these accounts, you were probably terrified of the possibility of an Indian raid on your village. You probably didn't have a particularly high opinion of the Indians. But I don't want to give the impression that this was all one-sided violence. You kind of get this attitude these days that the natives were just peaceful basket weavers, making clay pottery and braiding each other's hair, then the white man showed up, stole their land, and ruined it all. And I don't buy that, obviously. But I don't want to imply that the Americans were just sitting around peacefully reading their Bibles and trying to grow crops, and the Indians just started attacking them. The truth is that when you have different groups in close proximity, competing for land, resources, and power, there's probably going to be some conflict. On the settlers' part, there was the incident of the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys were a group of men from the hill country of Pennsylvania. They were of Scots-Irish descent. The Scots-Irish were from the war-torn borders of England and Scotland that had resettled to Ireland before coming to America, and that region they were from in Britain was in a state of constant war for centuries. So they were a very rough and tumble people. When other countries think of Americans, one of the most prevalent stereotypes is of these, racist hillbillies that love guns, hate outsiders, hate the government, that sort of thing. Well, that stereotype largely comes from the Scots-Irish. Anyways, the Paxton Boys were a vigilante group that formed during Pontiac's Rebellion, which was another Indian uprising against the American settlers, and they rose to fame when they attacked a group of Indians from a tribe that was allegedly friendly with the settlers. The Paxton Boys believed that there were no good Indians, and that tribe was actually spying for the Shawnee, who was another tribe that was not friendly with the settlers. Anyways, the Indians that survived the attack were given shelter in a workhouse in nearby Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Paxton Boys stormed the workhouse, broke in, and killed the members of the tribe that had been sheltered there. One witness to the attack wrote, "I ran into the prison yard, and there, oh, what a horrid sight presented itself to my view. Near the back door of the prison lay an old Indian and his woman, particularly well known and esteemed by the people of the town, on account of his placid and friendly conduct. Across him and his native woman lay 2 children of about the age of 3 years, whose heads were split with a tomahawk, and their scalps all taken off. Towards the middle of the galliard, along the west side of the wall, lay a stout Indian, whom I particularly noticed to have been shot in the breast. His legs were chopped with a tomahawk, his hands cut off, and finally a rifle ball discharged in his mouth, so that his head was blown to atoms and the brain was splashed against the wall." Ben Franklin said of the attacks, "The natives would have been safe among any other people on earth, no matter how primitive, except the Christian white savages of the Pennsylvania backcountry. And while many people, particularly in the eastern cities, were horrified by the brutality of this attack, no one was arrested, because no one from the mob could be identified, because no one in the town would inform on them," which kind of indicates that a lot of the townspeople were at least somewhat sympathetic to the Paxton Boys. But that incident really kind of soured the perception the Easterners had of people in the backcountry, that they would do something so bloody and inhumane. A modern example of this, you could say, is the Minutemen Project, if you remember that from the 2000s. It was a group of militiamen who would patrol the southern border with guns. It was one of those things where maybe your liberal aunt would look down her nose at them as being, racist, gun-toting vigilantes, but the people from the border communities were actually kind of supportive of them. This is a bit more of an extreme example, but it's a similar phenomenon. So while all this tit for tat is going on, the colonists didn't quite yet think of themselves as Americans per se, in the sense that Americans basically viewed themselves as Englishmen living on a different continent. The initial colonization was, of course, mainly undertaken by the English, but there were also waves of Swedish, German, Dutch, and Scots-Irish immigrants to the 13 colonies. And some of these waves of immigrants gave forms to the different regional characteristics of the 13 colonies. For example, Pennsylvania had a large German population. At one point, the Germans in Pennsylvania became so numerous that Ben Franklin remarked, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them?" Anglify means to become assimilated into English culture. "And will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion." So while there were some other nationalities present besides just the English, these other nationalities were being actively absorbed and assimilated into an Anglo-Saxon common culture. There was a sort of nascent American identity, but it was a bit more of a regional thing. Their colonial identities mattered more to them than being American. A man from Virginia would be more loyal to Virginia than he would be to the colonies as a whole. As one colonist wrote, "There is perhaps as great a difference between the tempers and habits of Massachusetts and the tempers and habits of the Carolinas as there subsists between some different nations. Nor need we travel so far. The Rhode Islanders are as different from the adjoining colony of Connecticut. Most of the colonies are rivals to each other in trade. Between others there subsist deep animosities respecting their boundaries, which heretofore produce violent altercations." So these people largely saw themselves as Britons living in America, not necessarily as Americans. And to the extent that they did see themselves as Americans, they were more loyal to their own particular colony than to the American colonies as a whole. The English heritage of the colonies was also a very significant element in the lead up to the Revolution. The English had a very sacred, almost quasi-religious view of liberty, and so, of course, the Americans did too. They viewed themselves as the inheritors of this ancient English political tradition that put a strong emphasis on liberty, rights, due process, and things like that. Your U.S. history class may have told you that these were new ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, but that's not really the case. These traditions can be traced back much further in English history than just John Locke. They were the result of a long and winding history of conflict and resolution going back to the Anglo-Saxons, the Norman invasions, a bunch of other stuff that I'll probably get into another time. But suffice it to say, English political tradition was very important to them. And the initial rise of the independence movement was over the belief that Parliament was violating these ancient liberties with things like the Stamp Act or the Tea Act. Groups like the Sons of Liberty believed that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies because the colonial charter was not with Parliament, it was with the Crown. So the initial gripe that the Patriots had with the king was that he wasn't doing his job of protecting their liberties from a corrupt Parliament. But still, most of the colonists believed that the king would be brought to his senses. Very few people in the colonies wanted full-blown independence. In 1774, Thomas Paine published his famous book, Common Sense, and was one of the first works arguing for complete independence from the British. At the time, even Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence, was not advocating for a complete severing of political ties with the British. Thomas Paine wrote of the colonies, "Their attachment to Britain was obstinate, and it was at that time a kind of treason to speak against it. Their ideas of grievance operated without resentment, and their single object was reconciliation." So this was just 2 years before 1776, and even then it was still somewhat taboo to talk about complete separation from the British. Most people just wanted to bring the king to his senses. So while the Patriot movement was gaining some traction, very few people wanted full-fledged independence. And as I pointed out, uniting the colonies to declare independence in unison was an even more difficult task when you bring colonial rivalries into the equation. If a single colony declared independence, would the other colonies that join in, or would they leave them high and dry to fight on their own? It seemed a near impossible task to unite the colonies against the crown. So what changed? On April 19th, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord. You may know the story. The British government feels that the Patriot movement in Massachusetts is getting a little too belligerent and declares Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. So British soldiers stationed in Massachusetts marched to Lexington and Concord to destroy military supplies stored by the local Massachusetts militia. Paul Revere goes on his famous midnight ride, warning everyone that the Redcoats are coming, and there's a standoff between the militia and the British soldiers. And the militia holds its ground against the Redcoats. This is where things get kind of interesting, because you probably heard about some of the events that led up to Lexington and Concord, like the Boston Tea Party. And you've probably heard about Paul Revere's midnight ride, warning the Massachusetts countryside that the Redcoats are coming. And as you can imagine, news of Lexington and Concord sent shockwaves throughout the colonies. I mean, here you are living in the colonies. You know that there are these tensions between the colonies and the British government. And now the tensions have finally turned into a hot war. Shots have been fired. What happens next? Are the Redcoats going to march on your town next? That's what you'd expect, right? But most of the colonies weren't afraid of Redcoats marching on their towns. The big fear in the colonies and the great ferment surrounding Lexington and Concord was actually a threat that was much more domestic. Slave rebellions. During the commotion, Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore ordered that the gunpowder in the Williamsburg public gunpowder storage be removed and stored in a nearby warship. The governor claimed that he was doing it to protect the city so that the gunpowder not fall into the hands of any rebellious slaves. But the citizens of Williamsburg didn't take it that way. They were upset. They thought that the move smacked of conspiracy. Moving the gunpowder actually left them more vulnerable and exposed to potential slave rebellions. The city released a statement in the local newspaper. There are various reports at present prevailing in different parts of the country that some wicked and designing persons have instilled the most diabolical notions into the minds of our slaves, and that therefore the utmost attention to our internal security is the more necessary. And Lord Dunmore responded with a statement that didn't quite help quell the concerns of the townfolk. He said, unless they acquiesced in his removal of the gunpowder, he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. So he's not exactly winning over hearts and minds with that statement. A similar incident occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, just a week later. A ship pulled into harbor with a letter from South Carolina's agent in London. The letter was addressed to the president of the Charleston Committee of Safety, and it said, in the event of an armed conflict with Britain, the administration was exploring granting freedom to such slaves as should desert their masters and join the king's troops. So from very early on, the Americans are already starting to fear that slave revolts would be used as a weapon against them. And rumors also began to circulate that the British would not only be using slaves, but also Indians. 1 month later, in May, British Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson sent a letter to Patriot leaders denying the rumors that he had any intention of stirring up the Indians to go to war against the colonists. But in that same letter, he warned them not to provoke him, that if he were taken prisoner by the Patriots, the Indians would not sit still and see their council fires extinguished and superintendent driven from his duties, but will come upon the frontiers in revenge with power sufficient to commit horrid devastation. So basically he's saying, I'm not going to rile up the Indians to go to war against you, but if you arrest me, I just might. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over very well, and delegates at the Second Continental Congress declared that Johnson had really endeavored to persuade the Indians to enter into a war with us, and that many steps had been taken by a bloody-minded and cruel ministry to induce those hereditary enemies of America to fall upon and butcher its inhabitants, the hereditary enemies of America. So there was a genetic component to this. They viewed the distinction between America and its Indian enemies to be a difference in blood. They were American not just by citizenship status, but because of their blood. So what had started as a paranoid rumor was now getting real traction, and more evidence was beginning to come out that yes, actually, the Crown was willing to use Indians and slaves to put down the Patriot Rebellion. And Patriot newspapers picked up on this. There was a sharp change in rhetoric from the Patriot press. Before the battles of Lexington and Concord, the rallying cry was to unite all people around liberty, consent, and the ancient rights of the sacred English Constitution. But now Patriot newspapers were warning people to defend their households from Indian massacres and slave insurrections that the king might use against them. If you remember the lead up to the Iraq War, when the news told endless stories about weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein's spurious connections to 9/11, this was the Revolutionary War version of that. Except, unlike weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War, this was actually real. The British were indeed planning to use Indians against the Patriots. Remember that at this point early in the war, the only place that was actually at war with the British was right outside of Boston. But the rumors that the British were planning to incite Indians and slaves to attack the colonists was spreading like wildfire all throughout the colonies. A Scottish woman visiting Wilmington, South Carolina at the time wrote, "The inhabitants of Wilmington believed that the British were promising every Negro that would murder his master and family that he should have his master's plantation." The fear of the South Carolinians was confirmed in July when a new report arrived that 250 blacks were in arms and under pursuit. According to the local militia, when they caught and arrested the mob, the slaves all confessed nearly the same thing, that they were one and all on the night of the 8th instructed to fall on and destroy the family where they lived, then to proceed from house to house, burning as they went, until they arrived in the back country, where they were to be received with open arms by a number of persons there appointed and armed by the government for their protection, and as a further reward, they would be resettled in a free government of their own. One Patriot leader confessed that in disarming the Negroes, we found considerable ammunition. That same month, the Second Continental Congress sent a message to the inhabitants of Great Britain, asking them to intercede on the Americans' behalf. The wild and barbarous savages of the wilderness have been solicited by gifts to take up the hatchet against us, and instigated to deluge our settlements with the blood of innocent and defenseless women and children. So here was the crime of the British. It was one thing to deprive the colonies of their natural rights as fellow Englishmen, but now the Crown was committing ethnic treason by attempting to rile up the merciless Indian savages against the colonies. It's one thing to tax somebody's tea, it's another thing to threaten to sick their worst enemies on them for opposing a tea tax. As Benjamin Franklin put it, Britain has found a means to unite us. What were those means? Basically racism. And I'm not using the word racism as a pejorative here. Ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of just a natural part of human tribalism. From over a century of interactions with the natives, the colonists had developed a strong sense of in-group preference towards their racial kin, a sense of racial solidarity, white identity. Even the ones that weren't English, Germans, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, and the Irish, they could be absorbed into the American colonies. But with the Indians, well, Indians could be traded with, and perhaps peaceful relations could be maintained for a period, but there was always a suspicion that they could change at any time and the Indians would attack. The memory of King Philip's War and many other Indian massacres were still fresh in the minds of the colonists. They were hereditary enemies. Alright, so now I'm going to revisit Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore was the Virginia governor who threatened to arm the slaves and burn down his city because people didn't like him moving the city's gunpowder out of the public storage unit onto a British warship. Well, it gets worse. In November of 1775, he issued a proclamation, and in it he said, "I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes or others, free that are willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the speedy reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity." This was pretty much every Virginian's worst nightmare. Clear as day, the governor of Virginia was telling the slaves that if they take up arms against the Patriots, they'll be granted freedom. Whatever loyalty to the crown there still was in Virginia pretty much died when Lord Dunmore issued that proclamation. One clergyman in Maryland wrote, "The ministerial agents are endeavoring to rouse the Indians against us. To complete the horrid scene, the governor of Virginia has been tampering with our Negroes, and have held nightly meetings with them, and all for the glorious purpose of enticing them to cut their masters' throats while they are asleep. Gracious God, that men, noble by birth and fortune, should descend to such ignoble base servility. George Washington called Lord Dunmore's plan a diabolical scheme. Patriot printers had a choice to make regarding the proclamation. They could either suppress it and hope the slaves didn't find out, which of course they would, or they could broadcast it far and wide to further incense the public against the British. They chose to broadcast it. That ended up being the right move. By the end of 1775 in New England, troops were growing bored. There hadn't been much fighting since Lexington and Concord, and several thousand men from Connecticut regiments made plans to walk away from the Revolution when their enlistments expired in December. George Washington reported to Congress, "Instead of pressing to be engaged in the cause of their country, which I vainly flattered myself would be the case, I find we are likely to be deserted at a most critical time." Another general wrote, "Where is the enthusiastic love of liberty that has ever been the distinguished characteristic of a New England man?" When news reached the northern colonies of Dunmore's diabolical scheme, enlistments jumped back up. Lord Dunmore essentially saved New England from the embarrassment of having their soldiers desert the cause. He galvanized the Americans against the British. President of the Continental Congress, Richard Henry Lee, wrote from Philadelphia, "Lord Dunmore's unparalleled conduct in Virginia united every man in Virginia. If administration had searched through the world for a person best fitted to ruin their cause and procure union and success of these colonies, they could not have found a more complete agent than Lord Dunmore." Ben Franklin wrote to an associate back in London, "The encouraging of blacks to rise and murder their masters, but above all the exciting the savages to fall upon their innocent outsettlers and farmers, especially when it is considered that the Indian manner of making war is by surprising families in the night, and killing all without distinction of age or sex. These proceedings of officers of the crown give people here a horrid idea of the spirit of your government." This episode kind of reminds me of the situation the Soviet Union was in during World War II. The Soviet Union was, of course, a very ideological state, and their ideology was communism. And communism is inherently anti-patriotic. Marx believed that communism would break down all national barriers, and there would eventually be no need for separate countries because they wouldn't be necessary under an international communist revolution. That's the SparkNotes version. But when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, how did they sell the war to the masses? Did they invoke communist economic theory about workers' rights and the labor theory of value? No. They called it the Great Patriotic War. There were even propaganda campaigns to rehabilitate and valorize Russian folk heroes. They used nationalism, and that's kind of what you see happening here. Sure, freedom and justice are well and good, but the idea that the king was essentially being a race traitor by attempting to employ slaves and Indians was a much more motivating idea to get people to fight for their country. Loyalist John Stuart bitterly remarked at the end of 1775, "Massacres and instigated insurrections were in the mouth of every child." I could go on and on with quotes and snippets from publications of the time. There's tons of them. Endless reports about the barbarity of the king, that he would stoop so low as to weaponize savages against his subjects. And the king's diabolical schemes didn't just involve merciless savages, it also involved other foreign mercenaries. In February of 1776, the Pennsylvania Journal published a letter from a, quote, honest, sensible, and spirited farmer, who wrote, "Have they not attempted to spirit up the Indian savages to ravage the frontier and murder after inhumane manner our defenseless wives and children? Have not our Negro slaves been enticed to rebel against their masters, and arms put into their hands to murder them? Have not the King of England's own slaves, the Hanoverians, been employed?" So you've already heard about the Indians and the slaves, but now they're also talking about Hanoverians. Hanover is a province in Germany that I guess was known for its militaristic culture. So now rumors are circulating that the king is also planning to use German mercenaries to put down the revolution. If you know the story of Sleepy Hollow with Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman is actually based on a German mercenary that lost his head to a cannonball in the Revolutionary War. Fun fact. The rumors that the king would be using German mercenaries were confirmed on May 4th. An American man had just sailed from Spain to Philadelphia, and in his convoy of ships were 12,000 German mercenaries that would be fighting for the crown. How did Continental Congress handle this news? They hired somebody to draft a letter to the German mercenaries. The letter said, "It is no small pleasure when in this first address we ever made to you, we must call you enemies, that we can affirm you to be unprovoked enemies. We have not invaded your country, slaughtered and wounded or captivated your parents, children, or kinsfolk, burned and plundered or desolated your towns and villages, or annoyed your trade? Do you think the cause you engage in is just? Were you compelled by your rulers to undertake the bloody work of butchering your unoffending fellow creatures? We wish the opportunity might be your motive, because we have the means and want not inclination to gratify your desires, certainly with more honor and advantage to you than victory can promise. Numberless Germans and other foreigners settled in this country will testify this truth. So basically saying, I don't know why you guys are fighting against us. If you're doing it because the king promised you money, then you should desert and join our side, and we'll give you even more money and land than what the king can offer you. Just ask any German who's settled here. They love it. Trust us, we know Germans. It's very important to note the distinction with how the German question was handled versus how the Indian question was handled. The Germans were offered land and money to desert the king. They were viewed as potential Americans who could assimilate into the American nation, because they were white. After the war, Ben Franklin wanted to commission a children's book of illustrations to teach American children about the Revolutionary War and why they had to declare independence. But the book never came to fruition, but some of the illustrations included savages killing and scalping frontier farmers and their families, women and children, English soldiers mixed up with the savages and giving them orders, encouraging them. Franklin even wanted American coins to be engraved with the depictions of runaway slaves killing their masters and Indians cannibalizing Americans. Strikingly absent in his list of illustrations was any mention of the German mercenaries. In fact, after the initial reports of the German mercenaries in 1776, as the war raged on, newspapers didn't even really print anything about German mercenaries. They kept the focus on the non-white mercenaries that the king was attempting to incite. That's a significant contrast and really highlights the importance of race to the Americans. Race represented the border around which true assimilation was possible. Americans were a people forged on the frontier, people of European blood whose experience taming the wilderness and their interactions with the natives gave them their national character. So other Europeans could become Americans too, but Indians and slaves, well, not so much. The signing of the Declaration of Independence was what formalized America's ethnogenesis. Remember, Americans as a people began branching off from the British in 1587 with the birth of the first American, Virginia Dare. You could argue that by the time of the American Revolution, we were already a distinct people from the British. But when the Declaration was signed, that's when we made it official. When a colonel read the Declaration of Independence to a crowd at Fort Ticonderoga, a man in the crowd remarked, "It was remarkably pleasing to see the spirits of the soldiers so raised after all their calamities. The language of every man's countenance was, 'Now we are a people.' Finally, we've done it. We are no longer British. We are our own people. Thank God." And what did it mean to be American? Well, part of it was defined in opposition to the British. Okay, we're not British anymore. But also we're not Indian savages or Negroes. And I want to emphasize that this conception of being American wasn't just because the Declaration of Independence said so. The Declaration was just describing the lived experience of Americans that developed over the last 2 centuries in the New World. When the Declaration of Independence was read to a crowd in Long Island, here's how they celebrated, as described by a bystander. An effigy of King George III being hastily fabricated out of base materials, with its face black like Dunmore's Virginia regiment, its head adorned with a wooden crown, and its head stuck full of feathers like the savages, and his body wrapped in a Union Jack and lined with gunpowder, was hung on a gallows, exploded, and burnt to ash. So they made a giant doll of King George, put it in blackface, and with a makeshift Indian headdress, blew it up. This could very well have been the first instance of celebrating the 4th of July with fireworks. The first Independence Day fireworks display was blowing up a racist effigy of the King of England. That's how they celebrated their new nationhood. America's ethnogenesis was obviously racial. Race was not the only component, but it was a strong component, probably the strongest. It's what made the Declaration of Independence possible. The reality of the frontier made Americans define themselves first as being not the natives, and later, when the British sought to put down the American Revolution by employing natives and slaves, they declared themselves no longer British. And this wasn't just a convenient act of wartime demagoguery and scaremongering the Patriots used to rile people up against the British. Even over a decade after the war, America created its first set of immigration laws, the 1790 Naturalization Act. The act set forward who was eligible to become a citizen of the new republic, and it explicitly states that citizenship would be limited to white people of good character. And this was emphasized again with the 1882 Immigration Act, also known as the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which barred Chinese laborers from becoming citizens. Proponents of the act argued that the Chinese were such a racially distinct people that they were unassimilable. During the infamous Dred Scott trial, during the lead-up to the American Civil War a century later, the judge argued that the constitutional rights did not extend to the slave Dred Scott because blacks had never been citizens of the United States, because they did not belong to the sovereign people for whom the Declaration of Independence was written. Remember, for ourselves and our posterity. Even America's folk heroes come from this legacy of white identity. I mentioned the incident of the Paxton Boys earlier, when a gang of backcountry vigilantes rose up to butcher a group of Indians that were being sheltered in a workshop, and how the news was received with horror by people in the eastern cities. That's kind of how the backcountry folk were viewed at the time. Wild, savage troublemakers that were only a step above the Indians in terms of their humanity. But after the war, the mountain men kind of became American heroes. Daniel Boone obviously being the most famous one. In 1784, there was a book released called The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, and there was a chapter in the book about Daniel Boone's adventures. What did Daniel Boone do in those pages that resonated so much with the American people? He fought the Indians. The Indians were portrayed as British proxies who had been inflamed to mischief by the king's agents, and Daniel Boone described their savage treatment of tender women and helpless children. And this gave rise to the rough and tumble backwoods mountain man that is mythologized as a quintessential American folk hero. There's this bizarre dialectic surrounding race in America today. A lot of people will say things like racism is un-American. It's un-American to restrict immigration at all. America is just an idea. Anyone can be an American. Look, it says it right there in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. We'll talk about the Founding Fathers as inspired men who were just caught up in the racist attitudes of their day. But now we've course-corrected and we've redeemed ourselves of this terrible racist past, and now it's un-American to even see race at all. That's kind of the conservative attitude, right? As long as you support the Constitution, you're an American. It really seems like a lot of people just equate America with the Constitution. But that can't be true, right? The Constitution is a great document, but a nation cannot be defined purely by documents and papers. The Constitution did not create America. America created the Constitution. As Alexander Hamilton wrote and explained the necessity of a federal constitution, with equal pleasure I have often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. The Constitution was created by Americans, for Americans, taking into account the unique national character of America. America is more than just the Constitution. It's history, it's blood, it's heritage, and yes, it's an ethnicity, it's nationhood. More left-leaning people will besmirch America and say things like America was built on racism and white supremacy.
America is racist to its bones.
And the reality is the leftist take on America is actually closer to the truth. They obviously view this as a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Tribalism is a natural human instinct. It's the basis of ethnogenesis. Remember, ethnogenesis occurs when an in-group defines themselves against an out-group, and in the case of America, that out-group was blacks, natives, and later the British. And it certainly seems like the founders were actually right that race is the border around which true assimilation is possible. And I think everyone understands that on an instinctual level. Take blacks, right? Some people were upset that they sang the black national anthem at the Super Bowl this year. You know, we're all American. Why are they trying to divide us by race? But it's really just a reflection of reality. I mean, blacks view themselves as a separate nation. As Malcolm X put it, we are not African Americans. We are Africans in America. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. I mean, it's pretty well understood that white Americans and blacks are distinct ethnic groups, two distinct nations. Why else would they have their own national anthem if they were not a separate nation? Recent non-European immigrants to America might be U.S. citizens, but they'll often identify more with their parents' or grandparents' country of origin before they identify with America and American history. And why should they? Their ancestors weren't here for it. And throughout most of American history, there were immigration policies in place specifically designed to exclude their ancestors. America is not just an idea. No nation can be just an idea. And being part of the American nation is not just what your passport says. Americans are a unique people with a unique history and culture whose national character is derived from being white people, particularly Anglo-Saxon white people, on the frontier of the New World. Our ethnogenesis began in 1587 with the birth of Virginia Dare and was made official in 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Some would argue that Americans are now a stateless people, that the United States and its institutions no longer represent the interests and the identity of those whose ancestors created it. And while things may look bleak for the American nation, we're still here. America was literally built on white identity. Some of you listening may be uncomfortable with that, but it's the truth. And folks, I'm just going to say it. God bless America.